Edward had been living his life in fast forward. Boardrooms, private jets, parties he barely remembered. He had everything, and yet something was missing. He was a millionaire, successful, untouchable. But that success had cost him the most important thing, his family. He had walked away years ago, thinking he was protecting himself, thinking he was choosing freedom. He didn't know he was burying the most precious part of his life. It was a hot summer afternoon when he finally returned. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet. The air hung heavy, like it carried memories it didn't want to release. Edward stepped out of his sleek black car. His polished shoes crunched on the gravel. He hadn't been here in years, not since everything ended. He approached the grave of his ex-wife, Claire. His heart tightened. He expected emptiness. He expected silence. He didn't expect what he found. 2 little girls, kneeling, crying, their tiny hands clutching flowers, their faces red and streaked with tears. And the shock hit him like a storm. "They looked exactly like him, Mommy," one whispered, voice fragile. "Mommy, we missed you." Edward froze. The girls were about 5 years old, their brown hair tied in small pigtails. Their eyes, the eyes of someone he hadn't even known existed. They stared at him wide and innocent. And in that instant, Edward realized he had a secret he had never imagined, a truth he had been blind to for half a decade. He took a step forward, voice shaking. "Hi, are you here with someone?" The girls looked at each other, hesitant. "This is our mommy's grave," one said softly. Edward felt the ground disappear beneath him. "My daughter's?" he thought. The word felt impossible. He had never known she was pregnant. Never knew she carried part of him, a part of his life he had walked away from. And yet there they were, standing in front of him, tears on their cheeks, calling his ex-wife Mommy, but he knew he was their father. His mind raced, questions, anger, guilt, confusion. Why hadn't Claire told him? How had he missed it?
5 years!
5 long years gone, and now the impossible was staring him in the face. Tiny, tearful faces. Lives he hadn't lived. Memories he hadn't shared. He knelt, trying to steady himself. "How old are you 2? He asked, voice breaking. 5, they said together. The weight of the years hit him like a tidal wave. 5 years since the divorce. 5 years since he walked away. And now, 5 years since his daughters were born. He had missed everything, every laugh, every step, every word, and it had been stolen from him, unknowingly. Edward wanted to hold them. He wanted to scoop them up and never let go, but he didn't, not yet. He needed to understand. He needed to know the truth. Do you know who I am?" he asked carefully, trying not to frighten them. We know a little," the other girl replied. Mommy said, "Maybe we'd meet you one day." That one line, that tiny flicker of hope, broke something inside him. He had a second chance, a chance to make right what had been lost. But it wouldn't be easy. These girls had been raised without him. They had grief. They had loss. They had memories of a mother but no father. And now, suddenly, he was here. Edward stayed with them, talking softly, listening to every word, earning small moments of trust. Each laugh he coaxed, every tear he wiped, was a step toward redemption. It was delicate, fragile, but it was real. By the time the sun began to dip, Edward had made a choice. He couldn't leave, not now. Not when the secret of their existence had been revealed. He would protect them, he would fight for them, and he would never walk away again. The journey wasn't just about legal battles or custody forms. It was about trust, about love, about showing up day after day for 2 little girls who had been abandoned by life and by time. He would need patience, endless patience. He would need courage. Unshakable courage. But most of all, he would need their trust. And that trust, he realized, could only be earned piece by piece, moment by moment. That night, Edward drove them to their temporary guardian's home. The silence in the car was heavy but not empty. It was filled with possibility. The girls clung to his hands. Tiny fingers, fragile and trusting. And for the first time, Edward felt the weight of purpose in his chest. He wasn't just a man with money anymore. He was a father, and fatherhood demanded everything he had, and more. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges. Guardians, court hearings, legal obstacles. People who doubted him, who questioned his intentions. And yet he didn't care. Nothing mattered except being there for them, earning their love, proving that he would never abandon them again. And so began the first chapter of Edward's true life. Not measured in wealth or power, but in laughter earned, trust rebuilt, and hearts slowly mending. The journey of a father discovering the family he never knew he had. A journey of redemption. A journey of love. The next morning, Edward woke up to a quiet house. Too quiet. He had slept poorly, tossing and turning, replaying every moment at the cemetery. Every tear, every whispered, "Mommy." Every heartbeat that suddenly mattered more than his empire, more than his wealth. He stepped into the kitchen. The aroma of pancakes greeted him. Diane, their temporary guardian, had already started the morning. But it wasn't her presence that mattered. It was the small, fragile figures sitting at the table, Sarah and Sophie, his daughters. And the first test of his newfound role as a father began right there. He tried to speak, tried to make small talk, but the girls were distant. Their eyes wary, their movements cautious. It was clear. They didn't trust him. And honestly, why should they? A stranger, a man who had never been there, gone for 5 years, gone when they had needed a father the most. Now suddenly back. It was a lot to process, even for tiny hearts. Edward took a deep breath and decided to approach slowly. No rushing, no grand gestures, just patience. He poured juice into their glasses and offered them a soft smile. "Good morning," he said gently. They didn't respond. Not at first. Sarah fiddled with her fork. Sophie stared down at her plate. Edward realized that trust wasn't given. Not now, not ever. It had to be earned. The day moved slowly. Every word he said, every movement he made was measured. He asked simple questions, tried to share small stories, tried to make them laugh. But the walls were still there. Invisible barriers built from grief, loss, and absence. Sarah asked questions carefully, choosing her words. Why weren't you here?" Her voice was small but sharp. The question hit Edward like a hammer. He swallowed hard. I made mistakes," he admitted. "I didn't know about you. And if I had, I would have tried." "I promise." Sophie didn't say anything. She just stared, judged, observed. And that quiet assessment was heavier than any courtroom or business deal he had faced. It was raw. It was real. It was fear, and Edward felt it all. Over the next few hours, he tried everything he knew. Offered snacks, read from a book, suggested drawing. Anything to break the tension. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, tiny cracks began to appear. Sophie allowed him to help with a coloring page. Sarah smiled faintly at a joke he made. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. But trust wasn't just about fun or gestures. It was about showing up consistently. And Edward had to prove every hour that he was different, that he wasn't going to vanish again, that he was a father now, not just a man who had returned to fix his past. Lunch came, and with it, the first real test. Diane had explained that they often resisted new routines, that they clung to the past, to stability, even when it was fragile. And Edward realized that his wealth, his power, meant nothing here. Money couldn't buy trust. Authority couldn't command it. Only presence, patience, and sincerity could. He decided to keep it simple. Sandwiches, juice, soft conversation. No pressure, just presence. And slowly, Sarah began to open up. "Mommy liked strawberries," she said, almost as a test. Edward nodded. "I remember. She loved them." That small acknowledgement sparked something. A flicker of recognition, of connection. Sophie, too, began to respond. Tiny questions, tiny smiles. By afternoon, Edward knew this was just the beginning. The walls weren't down, not yet. But seeds had been planted. Seeds of trust. Seeds of hope. And he would nurture them, every moment, every day. That evening brought the first real breakthrough. Sophie, curled up on the couch, reached for his hand. No words. Just a gesture, small, tentative, but it was enough to make Edward's chest tighten. He realized that trust didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces, in moments, in gestures that seemed insignificant to anyone else, but monumental to those waiting for love. Sarah remained cautious, but she began to participate in small ways. Sharing a story from her day, laughing softly at a joke, even asking questions about him, about their mother, about the life they had never shared. Each answer Edward gave was careful, honest, measured. He couldn't hide. He couldn't lie. The girls would see right through it, and he wanted them to see him, all of him. Night fell. Bedtime was another challenge. They resisted, anxious. It wasn't just bedtime. It was about letting him in, trusting him when all their experience had been of absence. Edward stayed patient, gentle, calm, read their favorite story, even though he stumbled on a few words. He didn't mind. They were listening. That was enough. Finally, Sophie whispered, "Can you stay until we sleep?" "Yes," Edward said, voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Sarah remained silent but stayed close. And that silence, that quiet presence, said more than words ever could. Trust, Edward realized, wasn't about promises. It was about actions, repetition, consistency, showing up again and again, even when it was hard. Over the next week, small routines developed. Breakfast together, walks in the park, quiet afternoons drawing or playing. The girls tested him constantly. Little acts of defiance, questions about their mother, silent stares that seemed to weigh him down. And Edward responded every time with patience, with love, with unwavering commitment. He learned quickly that trust was fragile. A small misstep, a moment of impatience could erase hours of progress. But each positive interaction reinforced the connection. Each shared laugh, each gentle reassurance, built momentum. And Edward, who had conquered business empires and negotiated million-dollar deals, realized that nothing mattered more than this. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while reading a story together, Sarah leaned over and hugged him. Just for a moment. But that moment carried years of longing, of grief, of questions answered silently. Sophie followed, wrapping herself into his side. Edward held them both. No words, just presence. Just the knowledge that slowly, the walls were crumbling. By the end of the first month, routines were becoming rhythms. Breakfast, walks, storytime, bedtime. Not perfect. Not without setbacks, but real. And Edward began to feel the first glimmer of hope that he could reclaim the lost years. That he could become the father they deserved. That trust could be rebuilt, one fragile. Painstaking piece at a time. The lessons were hard, emotional, exhausting. But each moment reinforced one truth: love. Presence, patience, these were the currencies of trust. Money could not buy it. Influence could not command it. Only he could earn it. One hug, one laugh. One story at a time. Edward had returned to his daughters, and now, slowly, he was learning the hardest lesson of all. That love, once broken, had to be rebuilt brick by brick. That trust, once shattered, had to be earned over and over. And that sometimes, the smallest gestures carried the heaviest weight. By the time the sun set, he knew it wasn't just about showing up anymore. It was about staying, about proving day after day that he would never abandon them. That the lost years might be gone, but the future, this future, was still his to fight for. And that fight had only just begun. Weeks passed, and the house slowly began to feel alive again. Laughter echoed in the hallways, and the smell of home-cooked meals replaced the stale scent of absence. But beneath the surface, unspoken tensions lingered. Edward could see it in their eyes. The questions they wouldn't voice, the memories they clung to. The invisible scars that no hugs could instantly erase. One rainy afternoon, while the girls played quietly in the living room, Edward stumbled upon a box tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. Curiosity piqued, he opened it, and inside were letters, photographs, and small mementos of their mother. Each piece told a story he had never known, a life he had never shared, and suddenly, the reality hit him. There were secrets he hadn't even known needed uncovering. Sarah wandered in, eyes wide as she noticed the box. "Mommy's things?" she whispered. Edward nodded. "Yes. I think it's time I know more about her too," he said softly. And just like that, a bridge began to form, not only between him and the girls, but between the past and the present. Over the next few days, they spent hours poring over the contents together. Photographs of birthdays, school recitals, and family vacations were carefully examined. Sarah would point out little details. "Look, she always wore that necklace when she smiled like this." Sophie traced her fingers over a crumpled card, reading aloud the words their mother had written. Each discovery pulled Edward closer to their mother's memory and closer to his daughters' hearts. It wasn't easy. There were tears, arguments, and moments of silence heavier than any storm outside. Sarah asked questions he couldn't fully answer. Sophie wanted to know why he had been gone, why he hadn't known. And each time Edward's chest ached, but he answered honestly, with the raw emotion of a man realizing that truth, no matter how painful, was the only path to connection. One evening, after a particularly emotional day, the girls asked him to tell them stories. Stories he had never shared before. Stories of himself, of their mother, of the life they had missed. Edward hesitated. Words felt inadequate. But then he began, voice trembling, recounting small memories of their mother he had heard from friends and family, sharing stories from his own childhood, and revealing the dreams he had once held. Sarah and Sophie listened intently, hanging on to every word. For the first time, they saw him not just as the stranger who had returned, but as a person with history, with pain, with love. And slowly the bonds began to strengthen. Trust was no longer tentative. It was starting to feel real. But just as the fragile peace settled in, the first storm of secrets erupted. Diane, who had been their guardian, pulled Edward aside one evening. Her face was grave. "There's something you need to know," she said. Edward braced himself. Diane revealed that their mother's passing had not been as simple as he had been told. There were complications, decisions left unspoken, and even hints of someone trying to interfere with the girl's well-being after her death. Edward's world tilted. He had been fighting for connection, for trust, without realizing there were shadows lurking just beyond their fragile safety. He knew then that protecting the girls would be harder than simply being present. He would have to uncover the truth, navigate hidden threats, and confront secrets that had shaped the last 5 years of their lives. Over the next days, Edward became both father and detective. Every phone call, every letter, every cryptic comment from acquaintances became a piece of a puzzle. He learned that their mother had left a hidden message, a set of instructions meant to guide him in protecting the girls. The revelation hit him like lightning. She had trusted him from afar, even when he had been absent. And now it was his responsibility to honor that trust. Amid the chaos of secrets and revelations, small moments of joy kept them grounded. Edward and the girls would spend evenings cooking together, baking cookies with flour dusting the counters and laughter filling the air. They built forts in the living room, whispered stories late at night, and began to discover shared jokes, familiar routines, and a new rhythm to their lives. Sarah began to confide in him more openly, asking questions about his life before he disappeared. Sophie started drawing pictures for him, leaving them on his desk with notes that said things like, "I forgive you, Daddy," or "Don't leave again." And Edward, who had spent years chasing fortune and power, realized that these small gestures, these tiny acts of love, were worth more than anything he had ever earned. Yet tension remained. The shadows of the past weren't idle. A distant relative, who had once been close to their mother, began making inquiries, questioning Edward's intentions. They warned the girls about strangers in their lives, trying to sway their fragile trust. It was subtle, manipulative, and dangerous. But Edward recognized it immediately. He had to act fast. With patience, honesty, and strategic care, he reinforced the bonds he had started to build. He explained difficult truths to Sarah and Sophie, prepared them for questions they might face, and assured them, repeatedly, that he would never abandon them again. Slowly, the girls learned to differentiate between empty words and genuine love. One pivotal evening, as the rain fell outside, Sarah asked quietly, "Daddy, will you really stay?" Edward took her hand, looked into her eyes, and whispered, "I promise. I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." Sophie, sitting beside them, leaned into his side, her small hands gripping his. And in that moment, the three of them were no longer fragments of a broken past. They were a family in progress, learning to heal together. But the past wasn't done testing them. Just when Edward thought he could breathe, he uncovered a hidden letter from their mother, sealed, addressed to him, and meant to be opened only when the girls were safe. Inside was a revelation that changed everything. a warning about someone close, a truth that explained years of mystery, and a challenge that would test the limits of Edward's courage and love. The discovery left him reeling. The stakes were higher than he imagined. Protecting the girls was no longer just about emotional bonding. It was about navigating threats, uncovering hidden truths, and confronting dangers that had been silently shaping their lives. Yet through it all, the emotional bonds grew stronger. The girls began to see Edward not as the absentee father, but as the protector, the storyteller, the man who fought for them in ways words could barely describe. Each day, each shared secret, each confession, each revelation drew them closer. And Edward knew, deep in his soul, that these bonds, the fragile, painstakingly built bonds, were worth every struggle, every sleepless night, every tear shed in private. By the end of this section, the house was no longer just a house. It was a sanctuary of trust, love, and fragile hope. But outside those walls, shadows lurked, secrets waited to be revealed, and the journey to true safety and unconditional love had only begun. Edward had learned that love wasn't easy, trust wasn't instant, and family wasn't given. It was earned, fought for, and fiercely protected. And now, with secrets unraveling and bonds solidifying, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the fight for his daughters' hearts and their safety was only going to get harder. Just when Edward thought the storm had passed, reality hit harder than ever. The house that had once felt safe suddenly seemed fragile. Shadows from the past crept closer, bringing whispers of doubt, suspicion, and betrayal. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every passing stranger felt like a test of his resolve. It began subtly. Strange messages appeared on his phone, unsigned but filled with threats and warnings. At first, he dismissed them as pranks or coincidences. But when the girls noticed a mysterious car parked outside their home one evening, their fear mirrored his own. Edward knew someone was watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. The fragile trust they had fought so hard to build now trembled under unseen pressure. The first betrayal came from someone Edward had never suspected, Diane, the woman who had helped guide him through the girls' early days. He had trusted her, confided in her, and relied on her insights. But a chance discovery revealed that Diane had been hiding critical information, details about their mother's death, about the inheritance, about threats Edward had never been warned about. When confronted, Diane's carefully constructed calm cracked. "I was trying to protect you," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't know how else to do it." But Edward saw through the excuses. Protection, yes, but at what cost? Trust had been broken, and in the eyes of Sarah and Sophie, the betrayal stung even more. They had believed in her, and now the cracks in their safe world were widening. That night, Edward sat alone, grappling with anger, confusion, and a gnawing sense of urgency. He realized that love alone would not shield them. He would have to be vigilant, strategic, and willing to confront the darkest truths. And the girls, still clinging to their fragile sense of security, needed him now more than ever. The tension escalated when Edward uncovered a hidden letter from their mother, previously missed. It revealed that someone close, someone he had welcomed into their lives, had motives that threatened not just their happiness, but their very safety. The words burned into his mind. Trust is earned, not given. Watch the ones who stay too long. It was a warning, precise and chilling, and it left Edward questioning every ally, every familiar face. Sarah began to sense the tension. She would watch Edward from the stairs, a worried frown creasing her forehead. Sophie became quiet, withdrawn, often clutching her mother's old necklace for comfort. Edward tried to shield them, but children are perceptive. They knew something had shifted, and the stakes were growing higher with every passing day. Then came the first real confrontation. A distant relative, once considered family, arrived unexpectedly. Smiles masked deceit, and polite conversation hid the sharp edge of manipulation. This relative began asking pointed questions about Edward's intentions, subtly undermining his authority, planting seeds of doubt in the girls' minds. They questioned his promises, his past absence, and even his ability to protect them. Edward recognized the danger immediately. Every word, every gesture, every glance was calculated. He had to remain calm, measured and unshakable. But inside a storm raged. The betrayal of someone he considered family, combined with Diane's earlier deception, made him realize that danger was no longer lurking. It was active, close and unrelenting. In the days that followed, Edward doubled down. He began documenting everything, keeping meticulous records of conversations, letters, and encounters. He reached out to trusted contacts from the past, digging for answers, connecting dots that had been deliberately hidden. Each discovery revealed a layer of deceit, a motive, a hidden agenda he hadn't imagined. The girls, despite their fear, began showing unexpected resilience. Sarah, once cautious and withdrawn, started asking questions, demanding honesty, and asserting herself in subtle but powerful ways. Sophie, sensitive and emotional, began expressing herself through drawings, each picture a window into her understanding of danger, loyalty, and love. Edward realized that protecting them was no longer just about shielding. They were learning to navigate the treacherous world around them. The emotional weight grew heavier with every revelation. Edward faced sleepless nights, haunted by the fear of failure. Every step outside, every interaction felt like a potential trap. The house that had been a sanctuary became a fortress, walls lined with vigilance and determination. And yet, in the quiet moments, he remembered why he fought. Because love had forged a bond that even betrayal could not sever. One pivotal moment came when Edward discovered that the relative had manipulated events in the past, influencing decisions about their mother's estate, controlling narratives, and even attempting to estrange the girls from him. The realization hit him like lightning. This was no minor threat. This was a long game of manipulation, and the stakes were heartbreakingly personal. Edward confronted the relative. Words were exchanged, sharp, cutting, unrelenting. The conversation ended with no resolution, only the acknowledgement that trust had been shattered and that vigilance was the only way forward. It was a harsh lesson but necessary. Edward understood that betrayal could come from the most unexpected places and that survival required clarity, courage, and unwavering love. Meanwhile, the girls witnessed his struggle. They saw a man fighting not for wealth, not for reputation, but for them, for their safety, their trust, their hearts. And slowly they began to grasp the depth of his commitment. Sarah whispered one night, "Daddy, we'll get through this together." Sophie nodded silently, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. In that moment, Edward realized that family wasn't just about presence. It was about facing the world together, hand in hand, no matter the dangers. The tension reached a peak when Edward discovered a hidden piece of evidence, a letter, a photograph, a name that pointed to a deeper conspiracy. Someone had orchestrated events in ways he hadn't anticipated, shaping their lives for reasons unknown. The revelation sent shockwaves through his already fragile world. Danger was not external. It was intimately entwined with their past, their family, their memories. Edward had a choice: retreat into fear or rise into action. And he chose action. Every plan, every precaution, every word of love he had shared with the girls became a tool in the battle ahead. They weren't just surviving. They were fighting for trust, for justice, for a future free from manipulation and deceit. The tension had been mounting for weeks. Edward could feel it in the air, in every glance, every footstep, every quiet moment before dawn. The house was no longer just a home. It was a battleground, a stage for truths that had been buried for years. Every secret, every lie, every carefully hidden agenda was about to be exposed. And the girls, Sarah and Sophie, were about to see that life could be far more complicated than they had ever imagined. It began with the letter. Edward had discovered it hidden in a drawer, unsigned, yet unmistakably tied to someone close. The contents were shocking. The letter revealed the full extent of the manipulations surrounding their family, the relatives' betrayal, Diane's silence, and even hints about people Edward had considered allies. It spoke of greed, resentment, and long-standing grudges that had shaped events from the shadows. For the first time, Edward understood the full scale of the forces working against him and the girls. The girls sensed the shift immediately. Sarah clutched Edward's arm as he read aloud, her wide eyes reflecting fear, anger, and a dawning understanding of the world around them. Sophie, quiet and thoughtful, held her mother's old locket, turning it over in her tiny hands as if it might shield them from the truth. Edward took a deep breath, realizing that this confrontation would not only decide their future but test the limits of trust. Courage and love. The relative returned unexpectedly, unaware that Edward had uncovered the full plot. The air was thick with tension. Words were exchanged, sharp and cutting, exposing secrets that had been long buried. The relative's carefully maintained calm cracked, revealing desperation and fear beneath the facade. Every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to control the girls' lives was laid bare. Edward confronted Diane next. The woman who had once been a guide and confidant now faced the consequences of her silence. She admitted her mistakes, her voice trembling as she confessed that she had believed withholding the truth would protect them. Edward listened, torn between anger and understanding. He realized that even betrayal could be rooted in love, or fear disguised as protection. The girls, meanwhile, were learning in real time what it meant to face betrayal, to question trust, and to stand firm in the face of fear. Sarah, once cautious, now spoke boldly, challenging the relative and asking the questions Edward had once feared to voice. Sophie, delicate but determined, showed courage in her own way, refusing to be intimidated, her actions proving that bravery comes in many forms. The climax came when Edward pieced together the final puzzle: a hidden financial record, a secret meeting, and a long-overlooked letter from their mother. It revealed the true motive behind the betrayals: jealousy, greed, and a desire to control not just the family fortune, but the girls' lives. The picture was clear, horrifying in its scope, yet empowering, because now Edward had the knowledge he needed. Armed with this truth, Edward confronted the relative and Diane in a single, decisive meeting. The confrontation was intense, emotional, and raw. Words cut like knives, accusations flew, and long-buried emotions erupted. Yet beneath the fury and heartbreak, there was clarity, an undeniable understanding that deception could no longer hold power over them. As the storm subsided, Edward turned to the girls. Their faces reflected a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and newfound strength. For the first time in weeks, they smiled without hesitation, without fear. Sarah hugged him tightly, whispering, "We knew you would protect us." Sophie pressed her cheek against his, her quiet confidence a silent testament to their shared resilience. The revelation had done more than expose betrayal. It had forged an unbreakable bond. Edward realized that family was not about the absence of danger, but about standing together in the face of it. Trust had been tested, lies had been uncovered, and the world outside had proven itself harsh. Yet within their small circle, love had become the ultimate shield, unshakable and powerful. In the days that followed, Edward took steps to secure their future. Legal matters were addressed, boundaries were set, and the girls began to rebuild their sense of security. But more importantly, the emotional wounds were acknowledged, discussed, and slowly healed. The lessons were clear: vigilance, honesty, and courage were as crucial as love. And even the most powerful bonds must be nurtured, protected, and defended. The story ended not with a final act of revenge or retribution, but with the quiet strength of a family forged through trials, betrayals, and truths. Edward had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The girls had faced fear and emerged braver. Together, they stood ready for the future, knowing that no challenge, no betrayal, no shadow could ever break the bond they had fought so hard to preserve. And as Edward looked out the window, seeing the world in all its unpredictable beauty and danger, he knew this: their journey was not over. But with trust rebuilt, courage renewed, and love unwavering, they could face anything that came next.